My son tried to exile me from my own home during Christmas dinner, claiming I was no longer family. He didn't realize I had already documented his fraud, frozen his bank accounts, and turned his own greedy trap into a permanent eviction notice. Before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. Christmas dinner smelled like turkey and betrayal. My son Michael stood up, his glass shaking in his hand, and the room went cold as a winter grave. Everyone at the table stopped mid-bite, their forks clinking against the fine china Elizabeth and I had bought 40 years ago. Michael cleared his throat, but it wasn't for a toast. It was a verdict. "Dad, you are no longer a member of our family," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a jagged blade. "We voted. Get out of this house." I sat there, my heart thudding against my ribs, watching my own son exile me from the home I built. His wife Emily sat beside him with a thin, sharp smile that made the hair on my neck stand up. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had already picked out the new curtains for my bedroom. The guests froze, their faces turning into masks of shock and pity. I felt the heat rise in my chest, a fire fueled by decades of overtime shifts and sacrifices they were now stepping on with their designer shoes. Michael gestured wildly, his face flushed with wine and a sudden ugly power. "This place is falling apart," he snapped, slamming his glass down so hard the wine splashed onto the white lace tablecloth. "You can't keep hoarding cash while we are stuck in this museum. We need progress. We want to modernize. Hoarding." I had paid the mortgage on this house before he was even out of diapers. I had worked double shifts on construction sites until my back screamed just to put him through college. I looked at the scratch on the oak table where he had carved his initials at 10 years old. Back then, I was his hero. Now, I was just an obstacle in the way of a leather sectional in a kitchen remodel. "I've given you enough, Michael," I said quietly. My voice was steady, even if my hands wanted to shake. "You live here rent-free. That is more than most people ever get." Emily scoffed, a laugh that sounded like silk wrapped around a razor. "Rent-free? Henry, we are doing you a favor by staying here. You're just holding us back with your selfishness." The word selfish hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. I tightened my grip on my fork until my knuckles turned white. They thought they had destroyed me. They thought an old man would just crumble and walk into the night with his tail between his legs. They didn't realize that being an engineer meant I knew exactly how to find the cracks in a structure before it collapsed. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like a scream. I looked at Michael, then at Emily. Their faces were mirrors of greed and a certainty that they had won. "I saw," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden quiet. "You've made yourselves very clear." I turned and walked toward the hallway, my boots heavy on the floor. Michael called after me, his tone mocking and loud. "What? That is it? You are just going to go sulk in your room?" I didn't answer. I reached the door to my bedroom and stepped inside, clicking the lock shut. The muffled sound of their laughter drifted through the wood. But I wasn't sulking. I pulled a plain manila folder from my desk drawer. It was thick, filled with the results of nights spent digging through the trash and monitoring the mail they were too lazy to hide. I walked back into the dining room. The silence that hit when I reappeared was different this time. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. I walked straight to Michael and handed him the folder. "Here is a parting gift for you, son," I said. Michael smirked, flipping the cover open with a cocky tilt of his head. Then he stopped. His face went from red to a ghostly, sickly white. He screamed, a raw sound of pure panic that rattled the glasses on the table. Emily lunged forward to grab the papers, her manicured nails tearing at the edges. Everyone was watching, their mouths hanging open, not realizing that my revenge had only just begun. The dining room remained a theater of the absurd as Michael stared at the first page of the folder. It wasn't a check. It was a formal eviction notice backed by a trust they didn't even know existed. But that was just the appetizer. Beneath it lay the documentation of their own greed, the late notices on the condo they bought behind my back, The credit card statements showing $12,000 in debt for designer bags and wine clubs, and the red-stamped foreclosure notice on their secret investment. "You can't do this," Michael yelled, his voice cracking as he looked at the guests who were now leaning in, their eyes wide. "This is our home." "No, Michael," I said, leaning over the table. "This is my house, and according to the trust I set up after your mother passed, you are just a guest who has overstayed his welcome." Emily's composure was gone. She was shaking, her eyes darting toward the door as if she could run away from the truth. "We only wanted to help you, Henry," she cried out, her voice high and desperate. "We thought you were becoming unstable." I didn't blink. I pulled out my phone and pressed play on a recording I had made just 2 nights ago. Her own voice filled the room, cold and calculating. "We'll say it's for his own good," the recording played. "Find him a nice little apartment somewhere cheap. The house stays with us. It's only fair." The room erupted. My sister-in-law Linda stood up, her face a mask of disgust. "You tried to sell his house out from under him?" she demanded, looking at Michael like he was a stranger. "You told us he was losing his mind." I watched them squirm. It was a cinematic reversal that felt like justice finally finding an address. Michael tried to gather the scattered papers, but his hands were trembling too much. He looked at me, pleading now. The bully turned into a beggar in the span of 3 minutes. "Dad, please, we can talk about this." "There is nothing left to say," I replied. "I've spent 30 years being the father who provided and forgave. I worked double shifts at construction sites until my joints burned to pay for your tuition. I sold my truck to buy your first car. I even paid $12,000 for your college applications in 2005. And this is the thanks I get?" I walked toward the kitchen, my mind already moving to the next phase of the plan. I had met with my friend Tom, a retired lawyer who knew how to cut through nonsense. He had told me to hit them where it hurts, their pride and their wallets. I had already called the bank and frozen the joint account Michael still used, the one I had opened for him when he was 18. He didn't know yet that his card would bounce the next time he tried to buy a round of drinks to impress his friends. I stood in the kitchen doorway looking back at the wreckage of the dinner. The turkey was getting cold and the family was fleeing. One by one, our relatives grabbed their coats, throwing looks of pure shame at my son. Michael slammed his fist onto the table, the plates rattling. "You think you're so smart, old man? You're going to be all alone in this big empty house." I smiled, a slow and deliberate movement of my lips. "I'd rather be alone in a house I built than surrounded by vultures in a house they're trying to steal." I turned my back on them and walked into the dark hallway. I could hear Emily starting to sob, a loud, performative sound, but it didn't move me. I reached into my pocket and felt the new set of keys Tom had helped me arrange. They had tried to lock me out of my own life, but they had forgotten that I was the one who designed the foundation. As I climbed the stairs to my room, the house groaned around me. It was an old sound, a familiar one. I realized then that I wasn't just protecting a building, I was protecting the memory of Elizabeth and the life we had worked for. Michael and Emily thought they were the future, but they were just a storm passing through. I sat on my bed and looked at a photo of Michael when he was 6 years old, grinning with a missing front tooth. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who saw his father as a bank account with a heartbeat. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from the bank. The freeze was active. The first domino had fallen. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. The scent of last night's turkey had been replaced by the sharp metallic tang of a winter storm rolling in. I walked downstairs to find the dining room in a state of disaster. Spilled wine had stained the white tablecloth a deep bruised purple. Michael and Emily were gone, likely retreated to the basement suite they called their own to plot their next move. I didn't wait for them to wake up. I had a 9 a.m. appointment with John, a lawyer who specialized in the kind of ironclad contracts that didn't leave room for misunderstandings. As I drove through the slushy Chicago streets, my mind kept drifting back to the $12,000 tuition payment I had made 20 years ago. I remembered the weight of the check in my hand and the pride in my chest. I had thought I was investing in a future where my son would carry our name with honor. Instead, I had funded the education of a man who used his words to slice me open at my own dinner table. John's office was a fortress of glass and steel. He didn't waste time with small talk. He laid out the revised will and the trust documents on the polished table. "You're sure about this, Henry?" he asked, his pen clicking rhythmically. "You're cutting him out completely. The house, the savings, every cent goes to the local veterans charity." "Completely," I said. The word felt like a heavy stone settling in my stomach, but it was a necessary weight. "He wants to treat this family like a business? Fine. He is fired." I signed the papers, the scratch of the pen sounding like a final bell. We then finalized the eviction order. 30 days. That was all the time they had to pack up their designer clothes and find a life they actually earned. When I got back home, the front door was locked from the inside. I turned my key, but it wouldn't budge. They had changed the locks. My pulse spiked, a hot flash of anger radiating through my limbs. They were trying to box me out of the house I had built with my own 2 hands. I didn't pound on the door. I didn't scream. I walked around to the back of the garage where I kept a spare set of tools. I grabbed a heavy crowbar and walked to the side door. With one sharp, practiced movement, I forced the frame. The wood groaned and splintered, a sensory jolt that felt like reclaiming my territory. I stepped into the kitchen to find Michael standing there, a cup of coffee in his hand, and a look of smug defiance on his face. That look vanished when he saw the crowbar in my hand. "What are you doing?" he stammered, backing away. "That is breaking and entering." "In my own house?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "I don't think so." "But changing the locks on the primary owner? That is a violation of your residency agreement." Emily came running down the stairs, her phone pressed to her ear. "I'm calling the police," she shrieked. "You are a danger to yourself and us." "Go ahead," I said, leaning the crowbar against the counter. "Call them. I'll show them the trust documents and the eviction notice I just signed. I'll also show them the recordings of you two plotting to commit guardianship fraud." She froze. The phone stayed near her ear, but she stopped dialing. The silence in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. They realized then that I wasn't playing a game of emotions anymore. I was playing a game of law and engineering, and they were built on sand. "I'm giving you a choice," I said. "You can leave now with your dignity, or you can stay for the 30 days and watch as I systematically dismantle everything you've tried to take." Michael stepped forward, his face turning that ugly shade of red again. "You think you're so tough because you have a few papers. We have friends, Dad. We have a lawyer, too. We'll tell everyone you've gone senile." I pulled a second folder from my coat pocket and tossed it onto the kitchen island. It contained the screenshots of Emily's text to my sister-in-law Linda, where she explicitly mentioned wanting to sell the house to fund a trip to Europe. "Your friends already saw the truth last night," I reminded him, "and your lawyer is going to have a very hard time explaining why you're using my Social Security deposits to pay for your car loan." The color drained from Michael's face. He looked at the folder, then at the splintered door frame. The power had flipped so fast he was still trying to catch his breath. The atmosphere in the house turned from a cold war into a full-blown siege. Michael and Emily stayed holed up in their rooms, the sound of their frantic whispering drifting through the vents. I spent my time in the living room, surrounded by the ghosts of a happier life. I looked at the photos of Elizabeth and felt a pang of guilt. She would have hated this. She would have wanted peace. But Elizabeth wasn't here to see our son turn into a predator. I wasn't just waiting for them to leave. I was preparing for the counterattack I knew was coming. Michael was impulsive, but Emily was the one with the poison in her pen. 2 days later, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find 2 police officers standing on the porch, the snow swirling behind them. "Mr. Wilson?" one of them asked, looking at my gray hair and my old sweater with a look of professional concern. "We received a call regarding a domestic disturbance and a concern for your mental well-being." I stepped back and opened the door wide. "Come in, officers. I've been expecting you." Michael and Emily came rushing out of the hallway, looking like the picture of worried children. "Officers, thank God you're here," Emily cried, her voice trembling perfectly. He broke in through the side door with a crowbar. He is obsessed with these folders and talking about people stealing from him. We are terrified. I didn't interrupt. I let them finish their performance. When they were done, I led the officers into the dining room. I laid out the trust documents, the eviction notice, and the bank records. Officers, I am an engineer, I said, my tone as even as a level. I keep records of everything. My son and his wife have been living here rent-free while systematically draining my secondary accounts. When I confronted them at Christmas dinner, they attempted to lock me out of my own home. I used a tool to enter my own property after they illegally changed the locks. I handed the officer the recording of their plot. As the audio played, Emily's cold voice talking about putting me in a cheap apartment, the officer's expressions shifted. The concern for me turned into a sharp, piercing look at Michael and Emily. "This doesn't look like a mental health crisis to me," the lead officer said, closing his notebook. "It looks like a civil eviction matter." "But he is dangerous," Michael shouted, his desperation peaking. "Look at the door." The officer looked at the door, then back at Michael. "If someone locked me out of my house, I'd use a crowbar too. You have 30 days to vacate according to this notice. If you interfere with Mr. Wilson again, we'll be back, and it won't be for a welfare check." The officers left, and the silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked like a man who had just watched his last bridge burn. Emily didn't say a word. She just turned and walked back to their room, the sound of her heels on the floor sounding like retreating drums. I felt a brief moment of triumph, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp sensory jolt of loneliness. I was winning, but the price was my family. I went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the steam rising in the quiet room. I looked at the $12,000 tuition receipt I had kept in my wallet like a relic. It was time to let go of the man I thought Michael was. I picked up my phone and called Tom. "It's time for the next step," I said. "Let's put the house on the market." "Wait," Tom said, his voice crackling over the line. "You're selling the house? Where will you go?" "Somewhere they can't find me," I replied. "Somewhere where I don't have to look at the initials carved into the table every day." The decision to sell the house was the final blow. I put the "for sale" sign in the yard myself, hammering it into the frozen ground while Michael watched from the upstairs window. The image of him standing there, framed by the curtains Elizabeth had picked out, was a vivid image of a legacy ending. He came flying out of the house a minute later, no coat on, his chest heaving in the cold air. "You can't sell this house. This is my inheritance. Inheritance is for those who respect the legacy, Michael," I said, not looking up from the sign. "You wanted progress. You wanted modern. Now you can find it somewhere else." Within 48 hours, the house was a hive of activity. Real estate agents, photographers, and curious neighbors swirled through the rooms. I stayed in the kitchen, a captain on a sinking ship that I was intentionally scuttling. Emily tried one last tactic. She came to me while I was packing a box of Elizabeth's old cookbooks. She looked tired, her manicured nails chipped and her eyes red. "Henry, we are sorry," she whispered, sitting across from me at the oak table. "We were stressed. The debts, the condo. We made a mistake. Please, let's just stop this. We'll pay you back." "How?" I asked, looking her dead in the eye. "You don't have jobs that cover your current lifestyle, let alone $12,000 in tuition and the thousands you've taken since. You wanted to sell this house and put me in a hole. Now you're the ones in the hole." She looked at the table, her hand tracing the same scratch Michael had made as a boy. "We have nowhere to go," she said, her voice finally losing its edge. "Then I suggest you start looking," I replied. The house sold in 3 days. A young couple with a baby bought it. People who looked at the oak table and saw a place for family dinners, not a source of equity. They paid a good price, enough to ensure I could live comfortably in a high-rise downtown where there were doormen and security cameras. On their final day, Michael and Emily packed their belongings into a U-Haul they had to rent with money they probably borrowed from a friend. Michael didn't look at me as he carried out the last of his boxes. He looked broken, a man who had tried to play a high-stakes game and lost everything because he underestimated the person who taught him how to play. I stood on the porch as the truck pulled away. The snow was falling again, soft and relentless, covering the tire tracks in the driveway. The house was empty now. just a shell of wood and brick. I went inside and walked through the rooms one last time. I stopped in the dining room. I picked up a small piece of sandpaper from my pocket and knelt by the table. I rubbed it against the initials Michael had carved all those years ago. M.W. I sanded it down until the wood was smooth again, until the mark was gone. I stood up and looked around. I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the victory I had imagined when I was a young father, but it was a victory nonetheless. I had protected myself. I had held on to my dignity. I grabbed my suitcase and walked to the front door. I took the keys out of my pocket and set them on the counter for the new owners. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut. The click of the lock was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I walked to my car, the cold air filling my lungs. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free. I started the engine and drove away, not looking back at the house or the sold sign. I had one last thing to do. I drove to the cemetery where Elizabeth was buried. I stood by her stone, the snow dusting the granite. "I took care of it, Liz," I whispered. "He is on his own now." I felt a light breeze, a soft touch against my cheek that felt like a blessing. I turned and walked back to the car. The city lights were calling, a new life in a new place. But as I reached for the door handle, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Dad." It was Michael's voice, but he was sobbing. "Dad, the bank, they didn't just freeze the account. They're asking about the signatures on the condo loan. They're saying it's fraud." I looked at the snow-covered trees and the silent graves. "I know," I said. I was the one who told them to look. The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a man falling from a great height. Michael's breathing came in ragged, wet gas that hissed through the speaker. I stood in the middle of the cemetery, my boots sinking into the fresh powder, feeling the cold seep through my soles. I didn't feel the rush of joy I expected. I felt the grim satisfaction of an engineer who had just watched a faulty bridge finally give way under its own weight. "Dad, you have to help me," Michael choked out, his voice cracking like thin ice. "They are talking about jail time. Emily is hysterical. She says it's your fault." I looked at Elizabeth's headstone, the granite gray and unyielding against the white landscape. "I was the one who worked the double shifts so you could have a name that meant something," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone. "You were the one who forged my name on those loan documents for that condo. You thought I was too old to check the mail or notice a missing signature." There was a long pause. The wind whipped across the open field, whistling through the bare branches of the oak trees. "How long have you known?" Michael whispered, the arrogance completely drained from him. "Since you bought the first leather chair with money that wasn't yours," I replied. "I gave you 30 days to leave. Use that time to find a lawyer who is as good as the one I have." I hung up before he could beg again. The phone felt heavy in my hand, a piece of plastic and glass that held the ruins of my family. I walked back to my car, the heater blasting as I steered toward the downtown high-rise that was my new home. The city felt different now, sharper, louder, and entirely indifferent to the drama of a retired engineer and his wayward son. As I pulled into the underground garage, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't Michael. It was a notification from the bank. A final attempt to access the frozen account had been logged at an ATM 3 blocks from my old house. Michael was desperate, clawing at walls that no longer had doors. I walked into my new apartment, the floor-to-ceiling windows showing the Chicago skyline draped in a veil of snow. The place was sterile, filled with boxes I hadn't yet found the heart to open. I sat on a simple chair and looked at the blinking lights of the Sears Tower. For decades, I had defined myself by that house and that boy. Now, the house belonged to strangers, and the boy was a criminal I had helped catch. A sharp knock at the door startled me. My pulse spiked. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the doorman hadn't buzzed. I walked to the door, my hand hovering over the lock. "Who is it?" I asked. "It's Sarah," a voice replied, muffled by the heavy wood. "Henry, please open up." I talked to Linda, We're worried. I hesitated, then turned the deadbolt. Sarah stood there, her red scarf dusted with snow, her eyes wide with a mix of pity and fear. She pushed past me into the empty room, her gaze darting to the unpacked boxes. "Henry, what have you done?" she asked, turning to face me. "Michael is telling everyone you've set him up. He says you're trying to put him in prison to steal his future." I closed the door and leaned against it. "He stole his own future, Sarah. I just stopped being the one who paid for his mistakes." Sarah sat on the edge of a packing crate, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. The apartment was dim, the only light coming from the city glow outside. "He's still your son, Henry," she whispered, the old argument that people use when they have no other defense for a monster. "Elizabeth wouldn't want this. She'd want you to protect him." "Elizabeth didn't raise a thief," I snapped, the anger finally breaking through my calm facade. "And she didn't raise a man who would stand at his own dinner table and tell his father he was no longer family. She'd be heartbroken, Sarah, but she'd be heartbroken by him, not by me." Sarah looked away, unable to meet my eyes. The silence stretched between us, filled with the hum of the building's ventilation system. I realized then that even my friends, people who had known me for 40 years, couldn't understand the depth of the betrayal. They saw a son making a mistake. I saw a structure that had been rotting for years until it finally collapsed. "You need to know something," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone. "Emily is talking to a reporter, some local digital news site that loves elderly father versus struggling son stories. She's going to make you out to be a villain, Henry. She's going to say you're abusive." I let out a short, sharp laugh. "Let her talk. I have the bank records, the recordings, and the forensic audit of the mortgage applications. Let her tell her story to the news, and then I'll tell mine to the district attorney." I walked Sarah to the door, my movements stiff. "Thank you for the warning," I said, "but I'm done being afraid of their shadows." After she left, I went to the desk and pulled out my laptop. I had one more piece of leverage, something I hadn't shared with John or Tom yet. When I had been digging through the digital history of our shared home computer, I found a folder Emily thought she had deleted. It wasn't just about the house. It was a series of emails between her and a real estate developer. They hadn't just wanted to sell the house. They had been promised a kickback for clearing the land for a new luxury development. My home, the place where Michael took his first steps, was going to be bulldozed for a parking garage. My fingers flew across the keys. I drafted a short, precise email to the developer, CCing the bank's fraud department and my lawyer. I attached the emails I had recovered. The pressure was mounting now. I could feel the clock ticking. Michael and Emily had 30 days to leave the house, but they only had 48 hours before the bank moved from inquiry to action. I was giving them one last chance to do the right thing, even though I knew they wouldn't take it. I went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept seeing Michael's face at the Christmas table, the way he looked when he thought he had won. It was the look of a man who believed he was untouchable. I closed my eyes and whispered a silent apology to the boy Michael used to be. The explosion happened on a Tuesday. I was at a small diner near my new apartment, the smell of burnt coffee and grease grounding me when my phone started blowing up. Dozens of texts from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, a few missed calls from Michael's cell. I opened the local news app. There it was, a headline about a predatory development scheme involving a local real estate firm and a young couple. The reporter hadn't just taken Emily's side, they had followed the money I had pointed out in my email. The story was public now. The social rung of the ladder had been bypassed entirely. We were straight into the legal and public ruin. I walked back to my apartment, my heart racing with a mixture of adrenaline and grief. As I stepped out of the elevator, I saw him. Michael was leaning against my door, his eyes bloodshot, his expensive coat stained and wrinkled. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He didn't look like a conductor of chaos anymore. He looked like a victim of his own design. "You destroyed us," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The developer pulled the deal. The bank is foreclosing on the condo today. Emily left me, Dad. She's at her mother's, and she says she's filing for divorce." I stood 5 feet away, my keys in my hand. You destroyed yourselves, Michael. I just held up a mirror so everyone else could see it too. He lunged at me, a desperate, clumsy move. I stepped aside, the years of working on job sites giving me a balance he didn't expect. He hit the carpeted wall and slid down to the floor, sobbing openly now. Please, he begged, reaching for my shoe. Just tell the bank it was a gift. Tell them you authorized the signatures. I'll do anything. I'll move out tonight. I'll never talk to you again. I looked down at the top of his head, seeing the thinning hair and the shaking shoulders. This was the moment I could have been a good father. I could have lied, saved him from the consequences, and gone back to the way things were, a life of quiet exploitation. I can't lie to the federal government, Michael, I said, my voice steady. And I won't lie for a man who tried to throw me out of my home on Christmas Day. I stepped around him and opened my door. Dad, he screamed as I started to close it. Goodbye, Michael, I said. The click of the lock was final. I walked to the window and watched him eventually stand up and walk toward the elevator. He looked small from the 20th floor. He looked like a stranger. I spent the next few hours with John on the phone. The legal process was moving fast. Michael would likely take a plea deal, probation and restitution, but his credit was gone, his reputation was in tatters, and he was effectively homeless. It was karmic justice engineered by his own greed and executed by my hand. Spring came to Chicago with a reluctant warmth, the ice on the lake finally breaking into jagged white slabs. I sat on a bench in a small park near the river, watching a young father help his daughter fly a kite. I felt like a man who had survived a long, brutal winter and was finally starting to thaw. The house was long gone, the sale proceeds safely tucked away in a trust that would fund a scholarship for trade school students, kids who wanted to build things with their hands like I had. My apartment was finally unpacked, Elizabeth's photos hanging in the hallway where they caught the morning sun. I hadn't seen Michael in months. The last I heard, he was working a low-level construction job in another state, the irony of which wasn't lost on me. Emily had vanished into the suburbs, her name forever linked to the fraud scandal in the local search results. I pulled a small, worn notebook from my pocket, the one where I had tracked their debts and their lies. I walked to a nearby trash can and dropped it in. I didn't need the evidence anymore. The verdict was already written in the quiet of my new life. I thought about the letter I had written to Michael, the one I had mailed to his lawyer's office. I had told him I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine. I had spent too long carrying the weight of his entitlement, and I wanted to walk the rest of my path with light steps. I stood up and started walking toward the riverfront. The city was alive with possibility, the hum of traffic and the shouting of tour boat guides creating a symphony of the living. I was 71 now, and my back still ached on rainy days, but my mind was clear and my home was my own. I stopped at a small coffee cart and ordered a black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just the way I liked it. The young man behind the counter smiled as he handed it to me. "Have a good day, sir," he said. "I will," I replied, and for the first time in a very long time, I meant it. I walked along the water, the steam from my cup rising into the crisp air. I looked at the steel and glass of the buildings around me, appreciating the engineering that kept them standing against the wind. Life is a structure, I realized. You can build it on lies and greed, and it might look beautiful for a while, but eventually the cracks will show. Or you can build it on truth and hard work, and even if it gets weathered and scarred, it will hold. I took a sip of the hot coffee and looked at the horizon. I had lost a son, but I had saved my soul. And as I watched the sun dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long golden shadows across the path, I knew Elizabeth would be proud of the man I had become. I wasn't just a father, or a widower, or a retired engineer. I was Henry Wilson, and I was finally home. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.